Pick it up at verse 18. Sorry, I was mentioning verse 9 and I didn't scroll to it. I apologize. I'm still getting used to having this. I think it's pretty handy to have for folks to be able to see that on the screen. And bear in mind, left side is New King James, right side is English Standard Version. So verse 18, and we were kind of wrapping up the chapter, but I basically read through these verses 18 through the end of the chapter, but we didn't really have a whole lot of time to comment much on them. And he says, "Yea, I hated all my labor which I had taken under the sun, because I should leave it unto the man that shall be after me." Now listen to what he says here. "And who knoweth whether he shall be a wise man or a fool? Yet he shall have rule over all my labor, wherein I have labored, and wherein I have showed myself wise under the sun. This also is vanity." That's interesting to me, because he says, he's thinking about this in terms of, we might say, his legacy or whatever. I've amassed all this wealth. And again, pointed it out last week, so many times in this chapter, so many times in this book, as he's searching, it's I, me, my, mine, forgetting about, where did he get wisdom? Where did he get the wealth, the ability to enjoy all these things in life? And he comes back to that in the conclusion, but on that journey, it's a whole lot of eye disease for Solomon. Not EYE, but eyes. And he was selfish and very self-centered. But he says, all this stuff that I've amassed, one day I'm going to leave this life. And, the old saying, you can't take it with you. Brother Billy Bland used to say to us, a lot of times in preaching school, one of our instructors, he'd say, you'll never see a hearse pulling a U-Haul trailer. You can't take it with you. He says, and then what happens? Well, it's going to go to somebody after me. Who knows? He just may be a fool and squander it all. Does that happen? That still happens to this day, right? And sometimes you even see very wealthy people that they almost despair over all their wealth and everything, because I can't take it with me, and what am I going to do? And they're thinking in terms of, their last will and testament, and, but my son, he's a fool. I don't want to leave everything to him. And sometimes even maybe because of the money itself obviously not being evil. We've mentioned that numerous times before as well. But there are some temptations that come along with money, and sometimes it can even bring into the family dynamic problems. And sometimes the very wealthy end up estranged from their children. It's like, well, what am I going to do with my money when I'm gone? And that's kind of Solomon's dilemma. And this is interesting to me too, because who's going to get all his stuff in Solomon's case? Rehoboam. And you know what history tells us about Rehoboam? He was kind of a fool. The people come to him. Solomon, and I don't know, it's some commentators speculate at this point in the book. I'm trying to remember, it might be Kaufman that was speculating, and it may be right. I'm cautious about it because I don't know. I just don't know. Putting it all together, it does seem logical and reasonable, but he speculates that a lot of this, Solomon testing this, testing that to try to find meaning in life and purpose in life and true joy, happiness, whatever, that he's, and maybe just part of building this massive kingdom that he had in general, but he has to, how does any government support itself? Taxes. And you tax the people. Sometimes you have a draft. You're drafting young men into military service. And in fact, remember when the people wanted a king? And Samuel was just torn up about it. He's going before God. He's weeping. And God says, you just give them what they want. They've not rejected you, Samuel. They've rejected me. But you need to tell them about the king. You need to tell them some things about this king that they are so eager to have. And he's going to tax you. He's going to take your young men, and they're going to become his soldiers. He's going to take your young women, and they're going to become his servants in his household, and they'll be, perfumers and confectioners and things like that. And you need to understand, it's not everything that you've just made it out to be in your mind. And sure enough, that happened with Saul to an extent with David, but boy, did it ever happen with Solomon, because there's just so much going on there, from building his own house to building the temple to building other things, other projects, other houses, just the upkeep of his household, which consists of no less than 1,000 wives and concubines. You can combine those numbers. So the burden was kind of heavy on the people to finance all of that. And a lot of gold coming into Solomon's kingdom as well, but there was a burden on the people. So the people come to Rehoboam, of course, in later on there in 1 Kings, and they say, hey, man, Solomon was heavy on us. Like, ease the burden some. And we're here for you. We are here to serve you, to be your loyal subjects. And Rehoboam, it almost seems like a shred of wisdom, I guess, because he says, well, I'll tell you what, come back in 3 days. And we might say, at least, give him credit for that. He didn't make a rash decision. He didn't just throw out an answer without thinking about it, although you wonder how much he thought about it. He says, come back in 3 days. So they come back, and he says, in the meantime, he goes to the older men, and they say, of course, do it. And they'll be your servants. It doesn't even take much. Just ease the burden some. But he goes, of course, to his friends, his peers, the younger men that he grew up with, and they have this response, oh, man, you need to tell them, go easy on you? How about this? You ain't seen nothing yet. My father is going to seem like nothing. He's going to seem like a wimp compared to me. And the kingdom divides. Jeroboam says, okay. And he says, to your tents, to the rest of the people. So 10 tribes break off from Judah and Benjamin and form the northern kingdom. Now, a lot of that, of course, goes back to the sins of Solomon, marrying these foreign wives, these idolatrous women who turned his heart away from God. Again, I still at least am inclined to believe that Ecclesiastes is kind of like an open letter of repentance of Solomon, where he learned better and is sorry for his mistakes there. But even if that's true, the consequences were still there. And God says, the kingdom's going to be torn from you, Solomon. So some of that's God's doing because of Solomon's sins, but a lot of that's Rehoboam. And I don't know, again, I think it was Kaufman that says, right around this section of chapter 2, he says, it seems Solomon maybe possibly already had some misgivings about Rehoboam. As he says, here's all of my stuff that I've accumulated. It's going to go to the man who will come after me. Well, surely he knew that was going to be Rehoboam. Who knows whether he'll be wise or a fool. I don't know. He may have had some inkling at that point. Maybe not. I don't know. But he goes on and he says, therefore I went about to cause my heart to despair of all the labor which I took under the sun. Again, he's so focused on this life and the things of this life. And he's talking about, one day he's sitting around, he's thinking about all his riches, his stuff. And he's realizing, I can't take it with me. It's going to be left behind, and somebody's going to come after me and have it. And, well, what if he's a fool? What if he just squanders it all away? And we touched on it last week. Rehoboam did, and not just that foolish decision in the beginning, but he did squander away most of Solomon's wealth. The kingdom very quickly went downhill. And it's like Solomon is just, all of a sudden, he's reeling from this thought, and he's like, oh, man, he's like despairing about it. It kind of, you could almost picture, like, well, what's even the point? Verse 21 says, "For there is a man whose labor is in wisdom and in knowledge and in equity, yet to a man that hath not labored therein shall he leave it for his portion. This also is vanity and a great evil." Remember how we talked in the beginning, that Hebrew word hevel, or hevel, sometimes it's pronounced, or I've heard it pronounced that way. That's like smoke or fog. That'd be the most familiar illustrations we could use. And smoke will sometimes take a shape, and it looks very solid, and you might try to reach out and grasp it, and it's just nothing. Or it might take a shape, and then just, it's next thing you know, it's in another shape, and clouds in the sky. You know, maybe when you were kids, sometimes we'd look up at the skies, and we'd say, "Oh, I see such and such," and you can see a shape, but sometimes it doesn't last very long, and the clouds are changing, you know, they're vapor. And he's talking about this accumulation of wealth and things and stuff, and you leave it to somebody that he's not even put in the time, the labor, maybe has not the knowledge. Again, we see that even to this day, and so it's just almost despair. And he said, "Man, this is emptiness. It's like grasping at smoke." "For what hath man," verse 22, "of all his labor and the vexation of his heart wherein he hath labored under the sun?" What's the point? "For all his days are sorrows, and his travail grief. Yea, his heart taketh not rest in the night. This is also vanity," grasping at smoke. I mentioned very briefly last week, I think, verse 23, just the idea of sleepless nights of the godless rich. You can't even sleep at night because you're so worried about your riches and your things and what's going to happen to them. Who's going to get them when I'm gone? That kind of stuff. Yes, sir. Yeah.
God said, "Since you asked for wisdom, I'm going to give you all this other stuff." So the blessing that came to Solomon was because that God was willing to give him something that he didn't ask for. But in this, he changed his thoughts. Well, I did this, I did that. And he did nothing without the help of God.
Yeah, and he kind of, like you said, he kind of lost sight of that.
His focus. You know, when Jesus said, "Lay not up yourself treasures on earth where moth and rust does corrupt," I'm wondering if he's looking back at Solomon.
Yeah, I mean, I'm telling you, the more I study this book, the more I think there are subtle references all through the earthly ministry of Jesus. I mean, there's just so many times I've thought about, hadn't even thought of that one until you mentioned it, but that's another one. When Robert mentioned when Jesus says, Matthew 6:19-21, "Lay not up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust doth corrupt, thieves break through and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and thieves do not break through and steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." Maybe he's thinking about Solomon, because Solomon's lost his focus here. He's forgotten God gave him all this stuff. And it's interesting because ultimately, it all belongs to God. Ultimately, in a sense, it all goes back to God. Now, we understand physical, material matter, it'll burn one day at the end of time. But in a more general way, it's going to go back to God. But I say that's interesting, kind of ironic, because when you get to chapter 12, he's going to talk about, I think it's around verse 7 of chapter 12, the dust will return to the earth, and what will happen to the spirit? It returns to God who gave it. And at least at this point, it seems he's kind of lost sight of that. And he's just kind of fixated on his stuff. I, me, my, mine. And again, it's is it Luke 14? I just went blank. 12. Luke 12, when you have the rich fool, we often call him, the guy that has, tear down my barns, build bigger barns, and God says, "Thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. Then who shall these things be?" And Jesus goes on to say, "So is he that is not," he might have wealth, but he's not rich toward God. And by the way, he begins that before he even tells that parable. It says, Jesus tells them, "Take heed and beware of covetousness." For a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesseth. You talk about, there are certain verses in Scripture that we read probably from time to time and just blow right by them, but they're some of the least believed, truly believed verses in Scripture. And that might be one of them, especially for people in this country where we're so blessed. Life does not consist in the abundance of the things that we possess. But we often find ourselves chasing those things. And that's kind of Solomon here. And he's just, at this point, it's like he just sits down one day and he's just thinking about, well, I mean, he said earlier in the chapter, I just look and you could just see through observation in life that, well, one thing happens to everybody. In fact, it even happens to the animals. Just like with the animals, just like with humans, we all die. And then what? And it's like his head is spinning. So, again, even to the point, sleepless nights, worried over this kind of stuff. Yes, sir.
You used the term a while ago, legacy, and we all have one.
Mm-hmm.
We realize it or not. It seems like Solomon came to this point, and his legacy up to this point had been on all these physical things, buildings, palace, temple, everything was physical. He's got to this point, and it's the wrong legacy. He didn't leave that legacy. It should have been his family, his children, all the things that would carry on, beyond this point, these things would do that. He realized that, he created this mess, and now he sees, I've been foolish, this is the wrong legacy.
And maybe that's kind of sort of part of the head spinning and despair here is that he realizes he doesn't have a legacy other than stuff.
Boys to he had his son, he could have left that legacy in and raised him up in a way to deal with these things that he created.
And that's a big deal because especially it's just kind of one of those differences in men and women. Not to say that women don't think about it, don't care about it, and some more so than others, but typically, especially for men, they start to get near the end of life. It might even be fair to say getting into older age, and they start thinking about their legacy. And I was trying to remember the three things Alan Webster told us a few years ago at our Men's Day. Studies have shown there are three things that really are on the mind of a dying man, and they will always seem to be concerned about. And his was in the context of Christian men, or at least men who would profess to be Christians. He said one of them was the state of the church when I'm gone. One of them, though, was legacy, we might say, my family. And sometimes you will see someone who is nearing death, and they are, man, sometimes even suffering and struggling and fighting and holding on. And I've seen it and even been there sometimes when a family member holds their hand, literally, or maybe they got their head cradled in their hand, and they say, honey, it's okay. Or Dad, we're all here, and we're okay. You can let go. And sometimes you just sort of see almost like, okay. Because that's a huge concern of a dying man. And I want to know my family's taken care of. And maybe it is, as Jimmy said, Solomon's kind of realizing, I don't have much of a legacy at all. My legacy consists of stuff that it may be squandered away, but even if not, the end of time is just going to burn. And so he gets kind of just, you can almost feel the heaviness here where he's down. And again, remember that as you read it, it's not, again, sometimes people will read this book and they're like, oh man, Ecclesiastes is so depressing. It is without the full picture, but don't lose the full picture. So notice in verse 24, he says, and I've said verse 24 like 5 times, but I do want to mention it because it occurred to me. Something Robert said that I keep forgetting to mention. Going back to what you said just a moment ago, Robert, he says in verse 9 he retained his wisdom. And I think that to your point, God gave him all these things, including wisdom. And God says, because you've asked for wisdom, I'm going to give you that, Solomon. That goes back to, chapter 3. Because you've asked for wisdom, I'm going to give you all of that. I'm going to give you that, but all the other stuff thrown in to boot, we would say. But Solomon forgets the source of all that. But I was thinking about what you said back to verse 9. He says, I still had my wisdom. Here's another possible take on that. Maybe what he's saying in verse 9, and he says it another place in chapter 2 as well, is I still had my wisdom from God, but I just wasn't using it. Because you can have wisdom, right, and just not use it. Or use it in a wrong way. We talked about that some last week, I believe. So maybe that's what he means. Nevertheless, verse 24. There's nothing better for a man than that he should eat and drink, and that he should make his soul enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw that it was from the hand of God. For who can eat, or who else can hasten hereunto more than I? It seems in verse 24 that he's saying all that his wealth has brought him in reality. I mean, he's looking at all this vast empire, essentially, all the wealth, all the blessings, and it's almost like he says, in reality, all it's brought me is just no more than that which comes from the working man's labor. I mean, I may have more toys, but what do I really have more than him? Because you know what's going to happen to the working man and me both? Well, we're just going to die. And whatever we have, however much, however little, it's going to be left to somebody. And I might have all this wealth amassed and leave it to my son, and he might be a fool and just squander it all away. But you know what? The poor working man over here, he's going to die too, and all his stuff's going to somebody. It might not even be very much. But what if his son is a hard-working, diligent man? And now all of a sudden he becomes great and wealthy. And who knows, it might turn around that the son of somebody like Solomon ends up a working man for that working man's son. You see how a person could just go crazy with those thoughts? So he says, God giveth to a man that is good in his sight, wisdom and knowledge and joy. Verse 26, well, if anybody knows that by experience, it's Solomon. Wisdom and knowledge and joy, but to the sinner he giveth travail, to gather and to heap up, that he may give to him that is good before God. This also is vanity and vexation of spirit, grasping at smoke. In other words. Oh, you remember the illustration we just used? Sometimes people struggle with that verse 26, that first part. You know, God gives to a man that which is good in his sight. How's it worded here? Sorry, I'm not scrolling again. Y'all just have to yell at me sometimes and say, hey, Chad, you're just not keeping up. So nothing's better for a man that he should eat and drink. No, I was looking at verse 26. For God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight, in God's sight. But to the sinner he gives the work of gathering and collecting, that he may give to him who is good before God. Man, sometimes, again, commentators, this is one of those where sometimes they wrestle with it, and they tried this explanation and that explanation. I think, I believe it was Copeland that had an explanation very similar to what the scenario we just kind of imagined there, where here you have a very wealthy man. He's accumulated all this stuff. He leaves it to somebody, and if that somebody is a fool, he's not wise, especially a wicked fool. But yet you got a poor working man over here. He dies. He leaves his meager whatever to his son or whoever gets it. But that person is hardworking. He's diligent. He's wise. And especially if he's godly. And so God blesses him. And he's blessed, he's blessed, he's blessed. And next thing you know, you may turn around one day and this fellow over here is his son. The son of the rich man is serving that son of a poor man because the poor man was blessed by God. Now, it's kind of like with Proverbs. That's not to say that that's always how it's going to be. But he's saying, again, Solomon's saying, I've seen this. I've seen it happen. I dare say we could go around the room and probably numerous people could give real life, actual anecdotal evidence where you've seen that happen. Solomon, he's just, again, I think the term that keeps coming to my mind is like his head is spinning. And he's almost in a despair here. I don't remember if I mentioned this last week, and I thought I had it in my notes, but now I'm not seeing where I wrote it down. I did mention at the end of class last week, but I want to mention it again here because Ecclesiastes, I think this, I'm kind of paraphrasing Kaufman here. Ecclesiastes as a whole, it ought to shake sense into any atheist or agnostic or skeptic, or, bear in mind, Solomon's a child of God. We sometimes apply these things to someone that we figure is like, not a church-going person at all. They don't believe in God, whatever. It might just be the unfaithful child of God. It needs to shake some sense into, because it portrays, really the whole book, the utter misery, despair, vanity of a life without God. It ought to scare us. It ought to cause our head to spin a little bit. Just to even try to picture a life without God. So I don't know. I wrote it down somewhere and I'm just not seeing it, but maybe it's on a different sheet. But what I was just going to mention, I think I might have said this last week, but Solomon is so despaired here that earlier in the chapter, at least, and kind of seems like a lot of the whole of the chapter, he's almost saying, as he just kind of sits there just reeling from all this, I mean, we do things, we build things, we accomplish things, and then just we die and we're forgotten. And it all goes away, it's forgotten. And yeah, to some extent that is true, but I mean, here we are, nearly 3,000 years later, we're talking about Solomon. So he's gotten himself in a pretty dark spot. And I don't want to say that without realizing that there is a lot of truth to that, and that's something that we ought to keep in mind, because as we often say, well, when men forget, is God going to remember us? Because men may forget us, but God will remember. Brother Guy in Woods in a sermon years ago said, 50 years from now, there may not be much remembrance of our existence. Or I think he said, it was something like that, 50 years from now. And then he said 100 years from now or so, it's unlikely that people will even know or be able to find where we're buried, for most of us. But as he says, when the time comes that men forget, will God remember? And that's something that we determine by how we live our lives. I thought we'd get on into chapter 3. Chapter 3 begins these first, 8 verses or so? Yeah. There's some contrast. And there are points at which we'll probably move a little quicker. We've really unpacked chapters 1 and 2 quite a bit, because in chapter 3, he's going to get into, you've got chapter 1 where he's shocking us into attention, and then he's going to start to unpack it a little bit. Chapter 2, he starts to describe some of the things that he searched for meaning in life, or things through which he's searching for meaning. And then when you get to chapter 3, he's going to start to describe some observations along the way in this journey. And so some of this, again, we'll move through a little more quickly, but I was trying to think, there was a phrase here on World Video Bible School's class notes. Where is that? Maybe it may be somebody else I was thinking of, but the notes here say, this was not what I was thinking of, but it's a good summary of verses 1 through 8, the providential workings of God. And even just the doings of humans. There's a time, as he says, to everything there's a season and a time to every purpose under the heaven. And that's difficult, isn't it, sometimes? Because sometimes we want to play when it's time to work. And, sometimes we talk about workaholics. It could even be that somebody, and it can happen to dads, especially if we're not careful, where we want to work when it's time to play. In other words, spend some time with the kids and do something fun together, whatever. Sometimes people want to laugh when it's not really an appropriate time to laugh. Sometimes people want to cut up and joke when it's not an appropriate time for that. Sometimes people want to entertain when it's not an appropriate time for that. We sometimes talk about that in the context of worship. There are people who they want worship to be entertain me, please me, forgetting who the audience of worship is. It's not us, it's God. We should be participants as his children. But there's a time for everything. Is entertainment wrong in and of itself? No. There's a time for that. Is joking around wrong? Sometimes my grandmother on my mom's side, we would spend the night with her a lot after Granddaddy died, and she would tell us some humorous story from her childhood. And you know how it is with grandmas. You sometimes have them tell you the same story 100 different times, but especially grandmother, because she would get just as mad if the 100th time telling that story as she did the first time she told you. And she would get just as mad as when it was happening, I'm pretty sure. But she'd tell these stories and we'd get to laughing, and sometimes she'd tell some, silly joke or something, and we'd laugh about that. And a lot of times it'd be kind of on late at night, and grandmother usually was an early to bed type person, but a couple of different times my sister and I were spending the night with her after Granddaddy died, and she'd say, "Oh, it's 10 o'clock." And she'd finish that story, and we'd all be laughing, and she'd say, "Oh, we better stop that foolishness. That's idle talk. I better get to bed." I don't know if that was just her escape to get away and get to bed, but she'd sometimes say that. And I began to think about that later on, especially as I got older and started studying the Bible more. The Bible doesn't say you can't have any downtime or idle time or silly talk. It's the idea when Jesus talks about idle words will be judged for, that's talking about it in the sense of spiritually. It's not saying you can't tell a good, clean joke or laugh about something. And I think grandmother knew that. I think it was just sort of her way of wrapping up the conversation and getting on to bed, I guess. But she would often say that, and we'd sort of get tickled about that and laugh, because it's like, I don't think the Bible says it's wrong to joke, grandmother. It didn't never stop her from telling us a joke the next time we were there either, so I guess she did know that. But there's time for everything. We get that, right? I'm going to stop there because I don't really want to get into chapter 3, 1 or 2 verses, and then have to pick up there next week. Anything else y'all want to add? I appreciate lots of good thoughts and comments today. Anything else?
Just think how different this book has been written. His focus, he did lose his focus to the conclusion.
Yeah, I mean, isn't that amazing? You think about it. God may have had Solomon pegged to write a book of Scripture all along, but it would have been so different had he not lost sight of. That's interesting. That's an interesting thought. But yeah, here he is telling us, man, I learned it the hard way. Y'all don't have to learn it the hard way. Learn from my mistakes is kind of what Solomon seems to be saying throughout this book. Anything else? All right. I'm out of soap. So we'll write it down. Somebody mark down the occasion. I'm finished before the second bell.